Good morning. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respect to all elders, past, present and emerging. The footprint left on the land our First Nations people walk spans far and wide. I would also like to extend my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands where people are viewing remotely today. I further extend my acknowledgement and respect to all cultures present. Thank you, Commissioner Boss, for your kind introduction and inviting me to speak. And good morning to all guests who are present here in Canberra and those who are present online. I would especially like to acknowledge all current and former serving members of Defence. There are some people in the audience who are very familiar with the role of the coroner. For those that aren't, I thought I would take this opportunity to provide a brief explanation of what we do. A coroner is tasked to independently investigate reportable deaths and make findings as to the identity, cause of death and circumstances surrounding the death and identify any potential prevention opportunities. We can also make comments and recommendations about issues that may reduce the number of preventable deaths and promote health and safety and the administration of justice. In Victoria, we investigate over 7,000 reportable deaths a year. We see many incredibly sad and traumatic deaths, including homicides, suicides, maternal and baby deaths, motor vehicle accidents, workplace deaths, falls in the elderly, deaths associated with the medical and surgical care, and some natural cause deaths. In my experience, many lessons can be learnt from the deaths of people that come into contact with the coroner's court. We have the unique ability to identify themes and issues with a view to making recommendations to hopefully avoid unnecessary and preventable deaths. With the ability to make recommendations, a coroner has the power to make change, prevent harm, and potentially save lives. I particularly love the inquisitorial nature of my job, which is, I liken it to a puzzle, where you have to find all the pieces and put them all together to get the complete picture, which by its very nature is often an evolving process. Many deaths, however, are preventable, and we are tasked to comprehensively investigate these deaths. Investigating these deaths often highlight when there have been systemic failures or inadequacies with certain policies and procedures. This is how we learn from death. When I started as a coroner over 8 years ago now, I was particularly struck by the vast number of suicides that occur every day in Victoria. It equates to over 2 a day and is more than double the road toll. This number is simply alarming and unacceptable. Many people have been touched, or should I say shattered, by suicide, including me. I lost a work colleague and a friend over 2 years ago, and I can honestly say that it takes a very long time to learn to process and live with their unexpected and sometimes unexplained devastating loss. The death of Jesse Bird is one such suicide that has had a devastating impact on many people, including his parents, Karen and John Bird, and I understand that John is now deceased, his former girlfriend, Connie Boglis, his friends and his former defence colleagues and veterans. It was also the catalyst for significant change and transformational reform by the ADF and DVA. Coronial investigations into suicide are necessary and important to attempt to gain an understanding of the potential underlying issues and precipitating factors relating to a person's decision to end their life, and so that opportunities for prevention can be identified. In the spirit of learning from lived experiences, this is Jesse's story. On the 27th of June 2017, Jesse Bird, a 32-year-old Army veteran, was found deceased in his home in St Kilda. It was apparent Jesse had taken his own life. No suicide note was found. But what made his death so different from many others I investigate is that prior to his final and fatal act, he had surrounded himself with his Defence Service medals, his army hat, some military equipment, and documentation relating to his service history, mental health issues, and DVA claims. This conveyed a strong and powerful underlying message to those tasked to investigate his death. It urged us to look further and search for his truth. Jesse's experiences during his army service, subsequent discharge and transition to civilian life, as well as his mental health history, financial and emotional stresses, and DVA claims history, all form an important part of his narrative. By way of background and to provide some context to this case study, I thought it was important to provide a short summary of Jesse's employment with Defence and the circumstances that ultimately led to his death. He enlisted in the Australian Army in 2007. He later trained as a rifleman and was a member of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, based in Townsville. Brigadier Andrew Hawkins described Jesse as a capable soldier with a strong sense of duty. According to him, Jesse was well liked by his peers and was a trusted and valued friend and could be relied upon even in the most challenging of circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin McLennan described Jesse as being a well-rounded soldier who took his profession seriously and could be relied upon to employ his skill at arms with mastery. Jesse was also known for his swimming prowess and general athleticism and had been identified as a junior leader. In May 2009, Jesse was deployed to Tarankot, Afghanistan for 9 months for Operation Slipper, which was part of the 2nd Mentoring and Reconstructing Task Force. He was 24 years old at the time. Jesse's deployment to Afghanistan as a rifleman was for Australia's military contribution to the International Security Assistance Force and International Coalition Against Terrorism. As many of you are aware here, the MRTF task force assisted in providing a secure environment for the Afghan people to hold democratic elections and mentor the Afghan National Army to develop their capacity and enable them in the short term to conduct counterinsurgency operations, primarily against the Taliban. Jesse's operational duties included undertaking security patrols, providing security for elections, searches of IEDs, providing cordons and safety nets, and searching persons and vehicles for threats. He was also required, when necessary, to engage the enemy under fire. Jesse was also qualified to provide combat first aid, which meant that he could provide initial first aid to other soldiers immediately following an incident until medical personnel were able to assist. During his deployment, Jesse also took the initiative to learn Pashto, a national language of Afghanistan. According to Major Thurkel, the ability to talk to locals in their own language proved to be a highly successful and useful skill, which underscored Jesse's determination to contribute to the overall team effort. In recognition of his service, Jesse was awarded the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Australian Active Service Medal, the NATO Non-Article 5 Medal, and the Australian Defence Medal. Jesse's good friend from his regiment explained that during their deployment, they were exposed to a number of life-threatening actions or hostile engagements with the enemy. This included IEDs, small arms fire, sniper fire, mortar fire and grenades, suicide attacks, vehicle bombing attacks, and medical emergencies. In July 2009, one of Jesse's close friends, Private Benjamin Renato, was killed by an IED during their deployment. This incident had a lasting impact on Jesse. Private Renato was the 11th Australian soldier to die in that war. In early September 2009, with the encouragement of his chain of command, Jesse self-referred for psychological assistance to cope with the death of Private Renato. Jesse's exposure to hazards and risks during his deployment in Afghanistan was documented in various occupational health and safety reports, completed by his commanding officers. The OH&S reports were designed to identify the risks defence personnel may have experienced and capture and record incidents and potential lessons. In December 2009, Major Thurkel documented in an OH&S report that Jesse should receive psychological support post-deployment. Another OH&S report documented 1 month later that Jesse had been exposed to possible mental trauma and recommended that he should receive psychological support post-deployment. Jesse returned to Australia in about February 2010. His family immediately saw an obvious change in him after his return from Afghanistan. According to his mum, Karen, when Jacqui returned home from his deployment, she noticed he was distant, moody, and intolerant of questions about his time over there. His mum attributed it to being a bit of a culture shock. Jacqui appeared to keep his family at arm's length, was reluctant to discuss issues of his deployment, and never spoke of his mental health. The evidence established that Defence undertakes deployment-related psychological screening to identify and provide early intervention for mental health issues experienced by Defence personnel during active service. Apart from seeking treatment from a medical officer for insomnia in April 2010 and a counsellor a few months later about being sad and pissed off about the death of his mate, no areas of concern were identified by Defence. In early 2011, he had surgery on his shoulder for an injury he sustained during his deployment to Afghanistan. Jacqui applied for discharge from the Army in about July 2011, whilst he was undergoing rehabilitation for this shoulder injury. He was formally discharged on the 29th of January 2012. He was recorded as having a physical injury to his right shoulder, and no psychological injury was documented. For the next few years, Jacqui struggled to assimilate back into civilian life, and we've heard evidence of that, not evidence, but we've heard that yesterday from Jeff Evans. He tried to find meaningful employment and consequently struggled financially. He had difficulty maintaining relationships, experienced unstable living arrangements, and would often misuse alcohol and illicit substances. At one stage, he even made attempts to re-enlist with Defence, but for some unknown reason, chose not to pursue the application. By 2015, Jessie's family noticed a deterioration in his mental health. Mrs. Bird, or Karen, commented that she became increasingly aware that her son was developing a deep-seated mental health issue that was directly related to his military service. She said his inability to get help just compounded that disease state. Later that year, Jacqui was formally assessed and diagnosed with mental health issues, including PTSD and anxiety and depression associated with his service in the Army. His GP referred him to a psychiatrist for treatment for his depression, PTSD and anger issues. Jacqui first saw his psychiatrist in September 2015. On clinical examination, he reported being miserable, despondent, with suicidal tendencies. My finding goes into some detail about his engagement with his psychiatrist and time at a PTSD clinic. Jacqui eventually lodged a claim with DVA on the 13th of October 2015, seeking access to healthcare for his psychiatric conditions, including ongoing treatment by his psychiatrist. The claim was accepted and DVA issued a white card entitling him to medical treatment for his accepted psychiatric condition. Jessie's mental health and emotional stresses appeared to exacerbate with the many delays and difficulties he faced in claiming financial support and compensation from DVA for his service-related psychological injuries. My finding details these multiple engagements and various interactions and procedures Jacqui navigated with DVA. I am not going to go into great detail here, but needless to say, it was very difficult for him. And for someone who was struggling with psychosocial factors in their life, the complex compensation system and overwhelmingly complicated bureaucratic processes and forms appeared at times to be insurmountable to him. On the 8th of May 2017, DVA determined that Jacqui was not eligible for compensation for his permanent impairment because he didn't meet the necessary entitlement threshold. And at that stage, he had not heard about what was happening to his incapacity payments. The reality was he hadn't worked since March 2016 and had been entirely reliant on money from his parents. Evidence during the inquest revealed that Jacqui was too proud to seek unemployment benefits. This rejection letter devastated Jacqui. According to Mrs. Bird, who spoke to him on the phone, Jacqui was very distressed and very angry about the rejection letter. Karen said that he was upset that DVA would just send a rejection letter with no follow-up. She said he had been led to believe that the claim would be accepted and he would have some financial payments coming in and he could get his life back on track. He had plans to study and didn't want to be a burden anymore. After the rejection letter, she said he isolated himself more and more. According to the Bird family, Jacqui essentially gave up on receiving any more help from DVA at this point. After Jacqui had filled in multiple forms, attended multiple medical appointments, and all the other factors associated with a claim for compensation, his frustration, disappointment, confusion, and fatigue all culminated in a conversation with a DVA officer 2 days before his death, complaining about the delays and outcome associated with his incapacity payments claim. After this call, he sent an email of complaint to DVA's complaints and feedback management system. His words are haunting in their utter frustration and plea for help, and worth repeating here. He said, and I quote, "I don't understand how two government departments with so much in common can't communicate. I need real help. I have submitted all required paperwork to receive incapacity payments, yet you fail to be able to speak to each other on my rank and pay grade on leaving the army. The person who has been assigned to my case just doesn't care and cannot wait to get me off the phone." By the sound of her tone and attitude towards me, she is someone who clearly finds no joy in her job. Quit and let people who care and can help take the job. If I didn't have the support of the RSL and my friends, I would and have come close to becoming another suicide statistic. I've done my time and now I need your help. Please, unquote. You will all agree this was a desperate cry for help. 2 days later, he took his life. My investigation revealed that there did not appear to have been any action taken by DVA in respect to Jessie's written complaint. Tragically, less than 2 weeks after his death, Jessie's claim for incapacity payments was determined and accepted, and the first payment went into his account. This was the final blow for his parents to fight for Jacqui and seek reform for the military compensation system. 1 month later, Jessie's parents, Karen and John, submitted an application for an inquest, and it was my case. At that stage, the coronial investigation was in its embryonic stages, so I deferred my decision to hold an inquest until I received all of the evidence. In my experience as a coroner, many, if not most, suicides do not progress to inquest. The investigation is usually finalised by a chambers finding, which is a finding made on the papers that is usually just distributed to the family and any other interested party. Unless the recommendations are made on a chambers finding, they are rarely published on our Coroner's Court website. Conducting an inquest into a suicide is not unheard of, but it is unusual, and there are usually compelling reasons to do so. After I received the coronial brief, which included the medical examiner's report, many statements from the family, friends and former colleagues, a large body of material from the Bird family about Jessie's defence history and attempts to obtain compensation, and various statements from the DVA and defence, including 3 separate inquiries that had been conducted, I decided to conduct a directions hearing to assist in my decision as to whether or not to hold an inquest. My initial thoughts were that this case didn't need an inquest. The immediate circumstances surrounding Jessie's death were uncontroversial. I knew his identity, his cause of death, and the circumstances proximate to his death. I also knew that there had been a number of reviews conducted into his death, that the Victorian Coroners Act explicitly states that we should avoid unnecessarily duplicating investigations. However, after holding a directions hearing to assist my decision, his parents convinced me to look further into his death, including the issue that there appeared to have been some systemic failings in DVA's management of Jessie's claims for compensation in the year prior to his death, which seemed to have been a contributing factor in his decision to end his life. And this was apparent in the way he had surrounded himself with his military items. and I observed the utter heartbreak and unresolved grief his family were experiencing. I felt they considered they were not being heard and that they would benefit from the therapeutic nature of an inquest. Consequently, I determined to conduct a limited inquest to examine Jesse's experiences during his army service, subsequent transition from the army to civilian life, and his attempts to navigate the complex DVA compensation system, as I've previously outlined. The inquest explored how psychological injuries such as PTSD manifest, the treatment options available for veterans, and the supports provided to defence personnel during service and following discharge. I also reviewed the ongoing reforms being implemented by Defence and DVA and identified further prevention opportunities designed to better identify, support, assist and compensate ex-service personnel at risk of or suffering from psychological injuries. As my investigation focused on examining systemic issues, I determined not to call any DVA and defence personnel directly involved in the management of Jesse's case. A number of witnesses were called, including Karen Bird, Jesse's treating psychiatrist, a volunteer veteran advocate, Major General Natasha Fox, and Liz Cosson, Secretary of DVA. The inquest was heard in May 2019 for 2 days, and the finding was delivered almost a year later. The delay in the finding, or the delivery of my findings, was due to the family's request to await the outcome of a Senate inquiry report, which was due to legal issues, such as parliamentary privilege, I was prohibited from referring to in my finding, even though it was publicly available on the internet and most relevant to my investigation. As I have previously outlined, my finding goes into great detail about Jesse's personal background and history, his enlistment and deployment to Afghanistan, his exposure to risks and hazards, his shoulder injury, discharge from service, return to civilian life, his post-army employment, and his engagement with mental health services. The majority of the finding examines his difficulty navigating the claim for permanent impairment and incapacity payments. During my investigation and the inquest, it became clear that Jesse had faced significant difficulties and delays whilst navigating the DVA processes. Consistent themes emerged throughout my investigation and other investigations into his death regarding the complexities of the DVA claims processes, including that Jesse felt he was treated as a number rather than a person, that some of his claims paperwork was either not registered or it was lost or rejected due to not being filled in correctly, which resulted in him having to go around and around and around and keep repeating the processes. There was a lack of adequate and personalised communication. There were different legal and medical requirements for each stage of the claims process, which were not clearly understood, and the claims process was a very complex system based on 3 separate and complicated pieces of legislation. Karen Bird described the DVA claims process as shambolic, randomised, and it had systemic weaknesses. She considered that the legislative framework has created a complex, inaccessible legal system for veteran support. She commented, "No one took the time to engage with Jesse, the human being. He was never more than a number of a file for someone to put on the back burner and look at another day." Karen Bird said Jesse did not have one positive engagement with DVA. There was no care model, no face-to-face communication, and no one ever asked him if they could help him. Jesse's negative experiences of the DVA processes were compounded by his PTSD symptoms. In evidence, his psychiatrist explained that due to neurocognitive issues associated with PTSD, including anxiety, cognitive and motivational issues, navigating DVA processes and paperwork can be extremely overwhelming for sufferers. During the inquest, important concessions were made by Defence and DVA. DVA conceded there were deficiencies in the processing and determination of Jesse's claims for financial assistance and in the complaints resolution process that followed Jesse's written complaint. The Minister for Veterans Affairs also made a formal apology on behalf of DVA to Jesse's family and friends for the way in which DVA's processes had failed him. These deficiencies were also openly acknowledged by Liz Cosson in court, where she acknowledged that there were failures by DVA surrounding the management of Jessie's care, and that there was no doubt in her mind that these failures contributed to Jessie's decision to take his own life. She added that when he needed them most, the DVA was not there. Further, that she was determined that DVA continues to change so that the risk of a veteran not being heard and supported in future is reduced to the maximum extent possible. Liz Cosson explained that Jessie's death had been a catalyst for significant reform and change within and a transformation in culture, process, systems, and essentially the whole nature of the organisation. She stated that DVA were now focused on the well-being of veterans and their families. At the inquest, Liz Cosson acknowledged there was still a lot to do, but she was starting to see practical and positive outcomes coming from the implemented changes. Crucially, DVA had undergone a significant organisational transformation, shifting from an adversarial, claims-based model to veteran-centric management, with the focus on considering the human rather than the claim. This shift was reflected in recent legislative reform that enshrined the Australian Defence Covenant, Veterans Covenant, which now acknowledges and recognises the sacrifice made by members of Defence. During the inquest, DVA highlighted all their extensive positive reforms that had occurred since Jessie's death, and there are 11 worth noting here. 1, having the leadership team undertake a deep dive into DVA processes to ensure they were best practice. 2, conducting regular case conferences to identify systemic issues or unwritten practices. 3, improving training of DVA personnel, including specialised training of staff dealing with particular types of claims, and encouraging those staff to take mental health courses. 4, streamlining DVA's numerous IT systems to enable frontline staff to have better visibility of a veteran when they lodge a claim. 5, the introduction of an online My Service portal for veterans to access support for a service-related condition or injury and access their DVA card and track the status of their claims. 6, improving formal communications to ensure letters and emails sent by DVA personnel are accurate, easy to understand and timely, and encouraging staff to speak with veterans by phone prior to sending a negative determination letter to explain the reason for the determination and their available options. 7, establishing a Triage Connect service whereby veterans with risk indicators are referred to case management and a DVA officer will contact them and help them to navigate the process. 8, engaging a chief medical officer responsible for assisting with streamlining of processes and engaging with clinicians to assist them in veteran literacy and provide clinicians with a better understanding of what it means to have served with Defence in the context of the compensation scheme. 9, simplifying treatment pathways for medical treatment into a single rather than dual treatment pathway model and providing DVA clients with access to healthcare through the DVA health card without the need to pay up front and later seek reimbursement. 10, engaging a chief data officer to gain meaningful insights from the analytical data available. And 11, continuing their partnership with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare to monitor and calculate accurate numbers and rates of suicide deaths among serving and ex-serving Defence members. You will agree that that's some extensive and positive change. After the inquest, I made the following conclusions and formal findings: that Jacqui experienced difficulty in his transition from Defence to civilian life, that he suffered from mental ill health directly linked to his experiences whilst deployed in Afghanistan. Jessie's mental health issues, including his diagnosis of PTSD, caused him difficulties in maintaining interpersonal relationships and obtaining and maintaining sustainable and meaningful employment, which resulted in significant financial instability. That Jacqui experienced difficulties navigating these processes due to his mental illness, which tended to overwhelm him and cause additional anxiety. The mountainous paperwork, complex terminology, extensive legal and medical requirements, subsequent delays, and financial stressors all appear to have exacerbated his mental illness. It appears his resilience and ability to cope with those pressures were exhausted. The evidence indicated that at the time of Jesse's death, DVA was claim-based rather than veteran-focused, and to Jesse, it appeared adversarial rather than beneficial. I found that the lack of adequate and accurate communication from DVA personnel to Jesse was problematic, in the sense that it was not a personalised service focused on Jesse, the individual. Instead, Jesse's perception was that he was treated as burdensome, and if paperwork had not been filed accurately, he was financially disadvantaged. There appeared to be a lack of care, attention, and proactive support, leaving Jesse with the belief that the only choice he had was to give up. This perception was evident in Jesse's written complaint to DVA. I acknowledge that DVA conceded that there were failures surrounding the management of his case, and that these failures contributed to Jesse's decision to end his life. My investigation revealed that a practice had been established within DVA that was contrary to law and policy, and that's now being fixed. The scope and nature of my investigation meant that I was unable to delve deeper into an examination of the whole DVA compensation system. However, I was satisfied that subsequent reforms had been implemented to identify and remedy any residual systemic issues in the claims process. I was further satisfied that there appeared and seemed to be a genuine commitment to improving DVA's systems and processes. I was extremely impressed with the evidence of Major General Fox, and I think she's over there somewhere. I've told her that. She was fantastic. And Liz as well, who have both served in the Australian military and brought with them essential operational and lived experience, and that helped inform my decisions. I was encouraged by the commitment of both Defence and DVA have made to continually improving their organisations. I was unable to say whether Jesse's death would have been prevented had these reforms been in force at the time of his claim. However, it is apparent that there have been significant improvements in veterans' experiences of the DVA claim since Jesse's death as a consequence of these reforms. I commended Karen and John Bird and his former partner Connie for their tenacity in seeking justice for Jesse. Their dedication and commitment to searching for truth and advocating for change to DVA and defence processes has resulted in significant reforms in both organisations. Jesse's legacy has been to ensure that both Defence and DVA better identify, support, assist and compensate ex-service personnel at risk of or suffering from psychological injuries. I thought long and hard about what recommendations to make in this case. As a coroner, you want them to be evidence-based, solution-focused, practical, with a common sense approach. And sometimes you'll even add your voice to the chorus of others. Ultimately, you want them to be accepted. And I resolved on 5 recommendations. And now with the passage of time, I'm in a position to share with you the responses to those recommendations. So recommendation 1 was I recommended that the Secretary of the Department of Defence consider how the information in its PM Keys system could be better shared with the Coroner's Court to enhance Victorian coroners' ability to identify veterans' suicides with a greater degree of accuracy, allowing investigating coroners to more effectively direct their investigation to build the evidence base for prevention, and inform the design and implementation of suicide prevention initiatives. That was the recommendation. And that was basically based on the fact that our investigations are only as good as the evidence that we get from people. So unless someone tells us that a person who has suicided was involved with Defence or DVA, we have no idea. So we may not investigate that path. So we need that information. The Commonwealth Government response was that the recommendation would be implemented and that the Secretary of Defence and the Chief of the Defence Force are supportive of sharing information that will assist the coroner. Recommendation 2. I recommended that the Secretary of DVA consider implementing a public awareness campaign directed to informing ex-service personnel about the recent reforms undertaken by DVA and encourage veterans to come forward to assist both in reconnecting with them and in building trust and confidence in DVA. The evidence in the inquest was that there are 500,000 veterans out there that DVA simply don't have knowledge of or access to. So now that all these positive changes are happening, I suggested that they need to do this public awareness campaign to bring them back into the fold and to know that things are different than what they thought they were once. The Commonwealth Government response was that my recommendation would be implemented. Recommendation 3. I recommended that the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel take the necessary steps to harmonise the legislation governing the Veterans Compensation and Rehabilitation Scheme. And yes, I was adding my voice to the many others that have been screaming for this for a while. The Commonwealth Government response was that my recommendation was under consideration. They confirmed that this matter was previously put to Government by the Productivity Commission into their final report into compensation and rehabilitation for veterans. And the Government response to the Productivity Review Commission is under active consideration and will be considered in due course. Recommendation 4. I recommended that the Secretary of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet extend the remit of the proposed National Commissioner to include powers to proactively review and audit DVA processes and to investigate veteran complaints. And that came basically from the Bird family wanting something in line with that. The Commonwealth Government provided an alternative to my recommendation and clarified the role of the National Commissioner for Defence and Veteran Suicide Prevention was to support the prevention of defence and veteran suicides and veteran deaths by suicide through examining the factors and circumstances relevant to these deaths. Recommendation 5. I got a lot of pressure from the Bird family to make a recommendation for a Royal Commission, and about the same time the Prime Minister came out and announced this new national role, so I decided not to go down that path. But recommendation 5, I recommended that the Secretary of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet provide an update to the Coroner's Court on the status of the implementation of the proposed National Commissioner within 6 months. And as we all know, a bill establishing the National Commissioner has been introduced to the Australian Parliament by the Attorney-General late last year and is currently under review. And we now have an interim Commissioner, Dr. Boss, and I'm very much looking forward to working with her, and it's a great outcome. And hopefully we can build some collaborative relationships and support one another. So this case summary is the result of 3 years of investigations and a 63-page finding. If you would like more detail, this finding is publicly available on the Coroner's Court of Victoria website. In closing, as I reflect on this case study, I am pleased and proud to have listened to the Bird family's plea to conduct an inquest. It will never bring their precious Jessie back, but it has hopefully allowed them to feel heard and provided some answers to their questions. His death has led to significant and transformational change in defence and specifically DVA, which has recognised the importance of the veteran and their sacrifice to their country, and attempted to make the system more user-friendly and veteran-centric. It has highlighted the unacceptable numbers of suicides of our veteran community and brought this to the attention of the Australian public. It has also created an opportunity for the National Commissioner to gain a deeper understanding as to why these deaths are occurring, focus on learning ways to protect those most vulnerable, with the aim to prevent suicide in this cohort of valued people in our community, all with a hope to creating positive outcomes for our members of Defence and veterans. I hope this case study has given you an insight into the role of the coroner in the investigation of these important deaths, and I'm now happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.